Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 20th, 2022. And let me begin with a shout out to my son Jack, who today is celebrating his 8th birthday. One of the reasons I do these updates is to make sure the picture of what we're facing in the future and what must be done to guarantee a better future is available for the children of today and the grandchildren of today, so that they can go into a better world than the ones that we've currently created. Now, an element of that is contained in a lengthy piece I wrote this morning, which will appear on my blog page in the next day or two. It's on London, Wall Street, and the Nazi International. And it's about something that was called in the 1920s bankers' fascism. That Nazism didn't start as a nationalist movement, but fascism was an international movement, a globalist movement, an effort to establish a rule of global corporate cartels over the power of nation states. But underneath it, they stirred up every single kind of problem they could, whether it's nationalism, racism, religious warfare, tribalism, and so on. In other words, the deployment of Nazis and communists to fight on the streets of Berlin in the 1920s was going on, funded by the very people who were pushing for global control of cartels over economic development, trade, and finance. Now, the same thing is going on today, as will become clear when you look at the article. Why is it that there was this big flap over Nina Jankowicz and the so-called Disinformation Governance Board? They had to hide it and come up with a new plan for it, because looking at her and who she represents as an interface between British intelligence, the Integrity International or Integrity Initiative networks, combined with the National Endowment for Democracy, the Democratic Party, and so on, that she represented a window into why it is that there have been networks in U.S. intelligence and diplomatic networks that have supported Nazism over the years. This goes back to the role of the financial cartels. Those are the Harrimans and the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds and Lazard Frere, the Standard Oil and other international companies today, including Cargill and Big Pharma. All of them have a stake in undermining national security, undermining national sovereignty for the purpose of their international agreements, their international looting. Today, it's the Great Reset. In the 20s, it was the trusts and so on. So what I look at in this piece is how this global order was set up in the 20s and 30s, but actually goes back to the British geopolitics of the beginning of the 20th century, which led to the two major wars, the Cold War, and could be propelling us to a war today. The effort by the London Wall Street globalists to prevent an alliance between Europe and Eurasia, with their fear that if such an alliance came together, the United States would dump globalism and join it. And then the whole internationalist cartel operation would be sunk. So I would encourage people to read it, because it cuts through a lot of the nonsense in the media today. And most importantly, it shows why it is that Jankowicz, why Biden, why Boris Johnson, why all the leaders of NATO are diving headfirst toward a war with Russia in defense of essentially Nazis in control of the direction and dynamic of the Ukrainian situation. Because that's what Putin said he had to reject, the neo-Nazism in Ukraine, the attack on the ethnic Russians by the neo-Nazis, the attempt by NATO to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. That's why we're headed toward a confrontation which could be nuclear war. So to get the background on this, I urge you to go to my blog page at thelaroucheorganization.com and read the story, which should be posted by tomorrow or Sunday. I would also urge you to look at the dialogue interview I did with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, which will also be posted at the LaRouche organization. It was a half-hour interview on the strategic situation, in which she started by saying, essentially, that this is the most dangerous period in world history. So again, that's available to you. When we're talking about fascism, we're not talking about swastikas and jackboots. We're talking about Shaktian austerity, bankers' fascism, which treats the majority of the human race as chattel or slaves, while carrying out policies that benefit the handful of people at the top, and for which war and violence and brutality is a weapon to keep the population under control. So again, take a look at the article, and I think you'll find it most interesting. Now, I'm taking up two questions today in addition to that. The first one, an interesting question from a Canadian reader who just talked about the problems in Canada and wondered if Russia would possibly strike over the Arctic into Canada if Canada becomes a problem. Now, first of all, I have no way of knowing what Russia will do, but Canada is not the biggest problem for Russia. It's a bigger problem for the people of Canada. The Trudeau government has proved itself to be willing to be completely subservient to the global international policy. Most interestingly is the Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, who is a descendant of a Ukrainian Nazi supporter, who is out front insisting on the degradation of Russia and the buildup for Ukraine. So the Canadian population is being held hostage by Trudeau, whatever he believes in, but also by Freeland. And this represents a potential threat. But the issue for Russia is not to attack every country that's attacking them, but to establish a new security order, one which every nation has security guarantees. Putin has made that clear repeatedly. This is what the Schiller Institute is fighting for. I would suggest if you live in Canada and you feel the oppression from your government, which is an outpost of the British monarchy, as you know, join with us, join the Schiller Institute, and fight for true sovereignty based on principles of economic development, as outlined by Lyndon LaRouche, the 4 laws based on an alliance of the 4 great powers. Canada has a potential to be part of that. If the people of Canada give up their subservience to the monarchy and their pessimism about their government, which admittedly is a pretty bad government. It's hard to get worse than the Biden administration, but it's a pretty bad government. But we need people mobilizing from the standpoint of a positive alternative. And that's what we're going to be presenting over the weeks ahead, including a major conference of the Schiller Institute at the end of June, and 2 events, May 25th and May 26th, which you can find registration for at theschillerinstitute.com. Now, the second question I'm taking up, many of you have been asking me, what about this new agreement that's being considered for the World Health Organization, which is a threat to national sovereignty? Let me clue you in on something, which you already know. We've mostly given up our sovereignty in Western Europe and the United States already. What do you think the World Trade Organization is? The World Health Organization isn't unique. There's the climate conferences and so on. There are a whole number of these agreements, including the Green New Deal agreement to establish a global bankers dictatorship, which is the Great Reset, in which in all of these, national interests play no role. These are treaties that give all the power to global corporate and financial cartels. So if the Congress signs some other treaty, it doesn't make that much of a difference. We've already given up much of our sovereignty. What matters is that under the proper political leadership, those anti-sovereign agreements can be tossed out the window, the way Donald Trump walked away from the Paris Climate Conference agreement, the way Trump walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership of Obama. International agreements that take precedence over national sovereignty can be overturned. Our Constitution affirms the sovereignty of the American people and commits the government to pursue policies for the general welfare and protection of the American people, not the global bankers and global cartels. So the idea that there's going to be some new treaty which is going to magically transform the United States into an underling of this global institution, that's just not the right kind of thinking. We already are in that circumstance, but we possess the capability to break from it. And that's what's important, is to understand what the actual policy is. As I point out in my article, the policy of the global bankers, which was called synarchism or bankers' fascism, was to subordinate any popular resistance to this global cartel through use of a dictatorship, a beast man. That was the whole idea of the synarchists, that you can use chaos in the streets to have emergency decrees like the aftermath of the Reichstag fire to eliminate the potential for people to mobilize. That hasn't happened yet. They've tried it. They tried it with 9/11. They've been trying it with the 2008 banking crisis. They're trying it today with all sorts of things. But it's very difficult to get the American people to